Okay, we're going to talk about inequalities in math, what they are, and then how they relate to the current grade situation happening in Ontario during COVID-19. And what, as a student, you should need to know, and as what educators we should probably consider with what's being communicated. So, an inequality in math is the concept of, it's the value that is, we'll say like x is greater than, well, let's say, 70, or x is greater than and equal to 70, or maybe x is less than 70, or x is less than equal to 70. And we can build entire equations like this. We could say like y is equal to greater than 3x plus 2, and then you end up like a Cartesian plane with a line, right? Because this is our equation for a linear equation, and y would be all this space above it, right? But inequalities also refer to what's happening right now. So what's happening in education in many boards across Ontario is a minimum grade has been put out. And minimum grade being whatever a student's grade was on March 13th. Great. So I've laid up two scenarios here. It might be hard to understand from this chart, but think of this as a student 1, and student 2. If you take a look on March 13th, they have two very different grades. So we'll call student, this is S2, and this is S1. And at this point in time, there's an 80, and at this point in time, it is a 20 that this student 2 has. So what's happening in the school boards is they've been instructed that a student's grade cannot be lower than this. So this is something called a floor. It's used in programming and mathematics. And a floor, all that means is a grade cannot go below this. So if you notice for student 1, that's now the floor, okay? And the floor for student 2 is here. All right, so the floor for student 2 is there, and the floor for student 1 is over here. Now, I've put some random grades in here, but the thing I did want to draw attention to is I've just put an arbitrary 10 assessments. Notice that student 1 gets some decent grades, essentially an average of 80 on the first 3 assessments, where student 2 gets an average of 80 on the 7th, 8th, and 9th assessment. They also have some assessments that they don't do very well on. Student 2 gets an average of 20, so a 10, a 20, and 30 on the first 3 assessments. And on assessment 7, 8, and 9, student 1 also gets those grades. The rest of the grades have just been randomly generated numbers, okay? So, but if you notice, 6 of the 10 assessments, these students have the exact same marks here. But what you'll notice in the grade, if you follow this line chart here, student 1, even though the grades have dropped below, the floor is 80. And that's not to say that I'm feeling that this is unfair or anything. Like, we're in a very difficult situation at the point. In fact, if this student's, let's say dry, if this student's grade, ooh, that's not the button I wanted. Hey, rad. There it is. If this student's grade has peaked up and then going back down, I want to talk about this scenario too. I think this is really important. But you'll notice what's happened for student 2 is, as of March 13th, their grade is 20. So no matter what student 1 does, their floor is always 80. So even at this point, they get above 80. Let's say their final grade here ends up as an average of 44. And I didn't mean for it to be below 50s. Again, I just randomly generated some numbers. But the floor is 80. So this student's actual grade is going to be 80. Where in this scenario, student 2, they end up with a 47, and maybe this teacher would round them up. But they had to fight the entire time, because at any point, their lowest mark would have been a 20. And notice that in the end, these two students have very similar grades, okay? You will notice at one point, and I really hope, oh good, it did. I should have chosen more specific. Notice at one point, I always do that. Notice at one point the student's grade does get to 70. Okay? And I just drew it in here, but let's say that this student's grade actually gets up to, 85. So this student's grade gets to, let's call that roughly a 50 at this point. I think as educators, and I'm going to go reference two documents and then come back to these two numbers. There's a professional ethical standards for teachers, and I just want to outline some parts here. So professional care for students, compassion during this time, and commitment to student learning, I think is really important. Members are dedicated to the care of commitment of students. They treat students with equitable respect. In my opinion, this is not a very equitable situation. Not due to the student's grades, but due to this floor parameter that's been put here. It's really not generating beneficial situations for the student. I propose, and I'm not saying this is a foolproof system, I propose something for peak average. What peak average would do would allow, and let's say maybe there's with a minimum of, 2 or 3 assessments, since by March 13th there were technically, let's say, like 2 or 3 assessments for many of the students. Peak average with a minimum of 2 or 3 assessments. So, for instance, student 1, they had an average of 80. Notice they finished with a 44 in the course. Their floor is 80, so according to this, the lowest mark they can get is 80. But at one point in the course, they were actually up to an 85. Who knows? Maybe a family member, something happened, and it dropped. This is a very unique situation in history. This 85 may actually be a more relevant grade for the student, and that would be their peak average. For the other student, student 2, at one point, they pull the grades up to a 50. But you'll notice they finished with that 47. 50 being the peak average would possibly a more relevant and more important grade. The other document I want to draw information from is growing success. This line right here, fair, transparent, and equitable for all students. I don't feel that the floor date of March 13th, I mean, it's not arbitrarily chosen. It's chosen because that was the last face-to-face, the time that students were face-to-face in their class. But I do not think that is very equitable by any means for these two students. Peak average gives every opportunity to the students to do wherever they were doing best in a course. That's what we're going to look at. So once you hit a peak, even if you go down after, don't worry, we're just going to take your best average at any point in the course. I propose that to educators as probably being a better way of assessing our students in a situation like this if we're going to continue in the way we're going with this current health pandemic. Okay, I think that was all. Oh no, the one thing I did want to say, for students, since transparency, you'll notice right here, very important, transparent. Since transparency is so important, you as a student, I think it's very important that you find out what that minimum grade is. Find out what your grade is at that point. Notice I put in a midterm grade here. The midterm grade, many students may think is their floor, their lowest point. But you'll notice for student 2 and student 1, that's not the case. Midterms were around the end of April, coming up really, really soon. But for this student, 80 was the lowest grade, right? So they may realize that, hey, 80 is much better than my midterm grade, and maybe I'll continue, or maybe there's something going on at home and I just don't feel like I could continue with this. It's because the mental health part of this, along with the physical health, are so, so important that maybe it is not worth it at this point to continue from 80. Where this student here might think, okay, 32, that's great, I can't go lower, but that's not the case. This date was set. At least with the language they used, the date of March 13th is not ideal. I think the heart of this is to really get students to be as successful as possible, and that's where, again, the idea of a peak average, I think, is important. So for you as a student, find out what your marks were on March 13th so that you know what the lowest potential grade you could get in the course. so that it's transparent to you. And educators, going along with your ethical standards and standards of teaching practice, and with growing success, being fair and equitable for all students, I think maybe a peak average might be a better solution than just an arbitrary date. And again, I said in growing success, you can, whatever you think is the most relevant information for assessment is what you can go on. You are the professional. You say what you think the student truly earned in that class.